Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. As we finish season 6 of the podcast, 100 episodes this year. Those are the standard episodes, plus the auction episodes, and the addition of Small Talk, which I've gotten great feedback and continue to get great feedback on. I want to thank everyone for listening, commenting, emailing, and all your feedback. I really appreciate all of that. Also, thank you to all the sponsors and those who sent smaller monetary donations, any support of the podcast. I really appreciate it. If anybody wants to sponsor an episode in general or a specific episode, if they have a topic idea, or just to generally support the podcast in any way, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. That's also the Zelle email for those interested. There's also link and information in the show notes. If anyone has specific guest and topic suggestions or a mini-series idea, there are actually a number of mini-series recorded already. The history of the early printed Hebrew book, as well as a 2-part mini-series in Yosef Rosheim, a mini-series on Rabbi Karo and Magid Meisharim. Those are all fully recorded or partially recorded and coming soon. So if anyone has any other ideas, please email or WhatsApp me and let me know. You can also find a link in the show notes to join the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, which Baruch Hashem this year has grown a lot, and there I post to Svarim, new books, book deals, and so on. Also, the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status, just more of the same in a different format. And finally, if you can, as always, if you can subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the podcast if you listen on Apple, but we're subscribe anywhere I listen, wherever you listen, 24/6, Spotify, Nucky, wherever it is that you listen. And with that, I want to wish everyone a ksiva chesima tova, a good gebencht yar, and enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Moshe Walter, who is the Rav of the Woodside Shul Avas Torah in Silver Spring, Maryland, and the author of a number of books, including Making of a Minhag, Making of a Mensch, Making of a Halachic Decision, and the newest one in the series, if you will, the Making of the Siddur. And I think Rabbi Walter had one about a year ago discussing various minhagim of this time of year, so I think it's appropriate this time of year as now, davening tefillah is always relevant. There's always an interest, as we were discussing before. There's always, do it on the podcast, a number of episodes, and I always get great feedback when I discuss episodes in the Siddur. People are always fascinated by the Siddur, especially the origins and some of the sources of the Siddur. But this time of year, now, Yom Naraim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur is very relevant. Tefillah, we're going to be doing a lot of davening. So I want to start off by saying this episode is sponsored anonymously in honor of Nachi Weinstein for his constant dedication to enriching the Jewish podcast scene. Also, this episode is sponsored by the Hoshana Rabbah Machzor. This is Hoshana Rabbah. Spend your time in shul davening, not flipping around your Machzor, reading complicated instructions in your Siddur. The Hoshana Rabbah Machzor has everything for morning davening in order with instructions specific to Hoshana Rabbah morning. Its slim size makes it easy to hold with your Arba Minim. For now, only Nusach Ashkenaz is available, and you can find a link to purchase via Amazon in the show notes. So, Rabbi Walter, thank you for joining me once again.
Thank you, Nachi, for having me. A pleasure to be here.
Why did you decide to write on this topic? So you have a couple of the making of this, the making of that. How'd you get to the making of the Siddur?
So the truth is, really, when it comes to all my books, and this one in particular, I try to talk and write about things that interest people. I never really intended to be an author, that's the truth. A lot of my works and books and articles really developed out of shiurim that I was giving, and when I found areas of interest that the tzibur, the kehila, was benefiting from, those ultimately, slowly but surely became write-ups and chapters became books, and one book became a second book. The Siddur, as you just noted, fascinates people. I was saying shiurim on the Siddur in shul on Shabbos every 4 weeks instead of a regular drasha, and before I knew it, people were just changed, fascinated, not by the explanation and the words of the tefillos, but really I focused a lot on the history, the development, the halachas of the Siddur, the background of the Siddur, the machloksim in terms of what is in the Siddur, what's not in the Siddur, what was accepted, what was not accepted. There's so much background that people are unfamiliar with that the origin, the background, the nature of the Siddur became something that really, really was fascinating to people. And once I saw that, I felt that there wasn't enough really written in English. And the truth is, even in Lashon HaKodesh, there's a limited amount of material that really goes through the breadth and depth of the background of the Siddur. And as such, I felt that this was an area that was worthwhile to invest time and effort into. And it's an area, I think, of rabbinic literature where there's not enough focus on. And hopefully this will be a book that will address that vacuum.
It's important to emphasize what you just said. This is a book focused on the origins, the sources of tefillah, not explanations of tefillah.
That's absolutely right. And just to add to your point, Nachi, I find that there's an unbelievable dichotomy. The Siddur is very interesting. On the one hand, if you ask your listeners, and yourself included, I would guarantee if you go to your Svarim Sharanka, to your bookshelf, the book that you have the most of is undoubtedly the Siddur. It takes up, shelves and shelves. The book that's used by men, women, and children is the Siddur. The book that you use from the time you're in grade school, at Me'ev Esrim, is the Siddur. So the Siddur is the book we're most familiar with. It's used the most. We own the most of it. But at the same time, I think if you ask some very basic questions about the Siddur, you'll find that people are very ignorant. For example, who wrote the Siddur? When was the Siddur written? How long did it take for the Siddur to be written? Can changes be made to the Siddur? Can additions be made to the Siddur? Were there multiple authors? Why are there different nuschos? That dichotomy really was also part and parcel of the interest in writing and working this through. Reb Shlomo Volbe, interestingly enough, writes in the earliest pages of his Alei Shur that it's the most difficult work of Chazal. The Siddur is the most difficult work that Chazal bequeathed to us, more than Mishnayos and Mesechus Yavamis, more than Mesechus Nida. The Siddur is the most complicated, complex work. So therefore, it needs explanation, it needs time, it needs effort, and it needs to be worked through in order to appreciate what we're able to do daily.
Why is it important for someone to know the origins and the sources of the Siddur? Especially we're going to get into, right? There's so many different changes in Nuschos today because you have those that daven Ashkenaz and those that daven Sfard, different variations of those Sfard. So there's regular Sfard, and then you have Edut Mizrach, actual Sfarad, and then you have different variations of that, and then there's obviously older Nuschos, Minig Reima, and Italian Nusach, and other ones that we don't even daven anymore. Not many people really daven anymore. Romaniot Nusach. You can go on and on with the Nuschos. So it's like I daven what I daven. I have my Siddur. I pick it up. Today we have all these standardized Siddur, right? You pick up whatever Siddur you buy in the local store. It is what it is. And I daven. What's the difference?
So I think it's not only true when it comes to Siddur, but in all areas of halacha and scholarship in general. The more a person understands the background and what goes into a conclusion of anything, the more it can be appreciated. It's true when it comes to Rosh Hashanah's coming, Yom Kippur. So if you walk into Rosh Hashanah and you don't know what Rosh Hashanah is about, you're not going to appreciate Rosh Hashanah. You could open a book. If you don't know who the author of the book is, why would you read that book? Daven a particular tefillah, but if you don't know who wrote that tefillah, well, why would you recite that tefillah? Anything that's meaningful requires understanding, requires an appreciation for who the author was, when it was written, what is this tefillah about vis-a-vis and what its inclusion in the Siddur. So I think the truth is really anything that's valuable, anything that's important requires depth, requires understanding. And I certainly can say for myself and others, there's no question that you will daven better. You'll daven better if you know something about Mizmor Shir Chanukas HaBayis L'Daven. And you'll know more and appreciate more saying Baruch Shamar. And the juxtaposition of Baruch Shamar to Mizmor Shir Chanukas HaBayis will also allow one to appreciate those two tefillos much, much more. Many people don't know the difference between Ashrei and Berchas Kriya Shema. Those are worlds apart. Just because it's in the same book and within 15, 20, 25 pages of each other does not mean that they're written by the same person at the same time period and has the same point. Shmon Esrei is not comparable to Aleinu, and Aleinu is not comparable to Birchas Kriya Shema. There are so many different influences that the Siddur had that it's important to be familiar with where the tefillos are coming from, who the author was, when the tefillah was written, why it was written, and very often many machloksim and disagreements and very strong machloksim. Hopefully we'll get into some of those in the show that were very, very heated. Some of them were cause célèbres of their time period in Jewish history. But appreciating the Siddur is a insight and a lens really into a lot of Jewish history, into different people, into different players, into different rabbinic leaders. So there's so much that the Siddur has to offer that's valuable in order to appreciate it, in order to be able to daven better.
Let's start off with Chazal. You mentioned a bunch of times who the author of the Siddur is. So let's go right there. Let's start off with who the quote-unquote author of the Siddur and the influences. Obviously, with the caveat, again, that there are so many nuschos, even just taking the three kind of ones that everyone's familiar with, well, not everyone, there's much more than this, but just Ashkenaz, Sfard, Edut Mizrach. Again, I'm just very general. I know there are many more break-off and small ones, being very general, but just let's start off with the genesis of the Siddur and the origins of the Siddur, as you say, the author of the Siddur.
So I think if you would ask that question to anybody, and I often do, who authored the Siddur, the answer that will be overwhelmingly given by most is the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. Now, that's true and it's not true. It's true because Chazal said, the Gemara says, Mesechus Brachos, that Anshe Knesset Gedola tiknu tfilos, brachos, kedushos, v'havdalos. It's a very cryptic statement, but the Gemara says, Brachos Taf Lamed Gimel, I believe, that Anshe Knesset Gedola established those four things, kedusha, v'havdala, tefillah, and bracha. But that's not really teaching us much, and what does that mean? So the Gemara tells us, Mesechus Megillah Daf Yud Zayin, that Anshe Knesset Gedola has certainly established one thing that we know for absolute clarity, and that is Shemona Esrei. They established the Shemona Esrei. So certainly Anshe Knesset Gedola established some of the earliest brachos, Berachos Kriyas Shema, Shemona Esrei, Kedusha, Havdalah. So certainly the skeleton of what we call Tefillah and of what we call the Siddur emerges from Ezra Sofer. So much so that the Rambam writes in the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah, an amazing line, a powerful line, something you don't always see in the Rambam, Mimos Moshe Rabbeinu ad Ezra HaSofer. That means for a very significant amount of time, 1,000 years, there was no such thing as what to daven, when to daven, how to daven. Everybody davened what they wanted, when they wanted, and there was no rule. There was no absolute requirement. Ezra Sofer came and it began to establish something that created a uniformity in Klal Yisrael. Ezra Sofer was a giant, and Ezra Sofer appreciated that Klal Yisrael needed a level of uniformity because people weren't able to speak anymore. There was assimilation, there was exile, there was dispersion, and therefore the Jewish community needed to some level to have some basic uniform text of tefillah. That's what Ezra HaSofer did. But that still did not create the Siddur. There was no Siddur. There was no book. There was no work. There was no text. There was a Kabbalah. There was some level of tradition that existed. The first Siddur that ever existed, of course, was the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon. I think that we could all agree that that's the case. Rav Amram Gaon was one of the great Gaonim, lived in the 800s. He died in 875. Rav Amram Gaon's Siddur was actually called the Seder Rav Amram Gaon, as a result of a fascinating incident that occurred. The Jewish community of Spain and Barcelona was a very important community in the 800s, and they were the largest, most significant Jewish community. And listen to this, Nachi. They didn't know how to daven. They were lost. So, we always talk about, the assimilation and the exile and the lack of yedias in variety of different generations and in Klal Yisrael, whatever country and continent you live in. But in the year 800, roughly, the Jewish community of Barcelona and its rabbinate needed direction in terms of encouraging their community how they would be able to daven properly. They didn't know how to daven. There's no cheder, there's no school, there's no, there's no basic situation that allowed for education in the Jewish community. So they sent a letter to Rabbi Gaon in Bavel, who responded to the question that they asked, teach us a Seder, give us some direction in how to daven. Rav Amram Gaon sent them what he called the Seder of Amram Gaon, which is essentially became the template of the first Siddur that we have. So that was sent from Bavel to Barcelona, and that became what we would agree is the first Siddur that existed. But as I always point out, that wasn't the end of the story. That actually was the beginning of a problem. Because as we're familiar, this is well before the era of the printing press, and because of the importance and the value and the high level which the Jewish community placed in Rav Amram Gaon and in his Siddur, everybody wanted a piece of that Siddur and wanted to see that Siddur. So every chazan and every yeshiva and every beis medrash, every beis HaKnesses throughout the world wanted to get a hold of that manuscript. And as many things occurred in that era, in 800s, 900s, 1000s, beyond, there were typos, there were mistakes, and there were transcripts that were copied, and this chazan copied this way, and this chazan copied that way, and things began to get out of hand, and we don't exactly know what specifically was the nusach of Rav Amram Gaon, and therefore over the centuries and over history, so in the last 100 years, a lot of time and scholarship has gone into figuring out what is the ultimate and the real Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. You could take a look. There are 3, 4 wonderful different editions of the Seder of Amram Gaon today, but that's really the first Seder. But again, I could go on and talk a lot about the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, and certainly I could go on and describe that was not the end of the Seder. So to answer your question briefly, yes, the first context and the first template of tefillah we have is the Anshe Knesset Gedola, is Ezra Sofer. The first written work is written by Rav Amram Gaon, and it continued to go from there. We could talk about that further, of course.
Yeah, we could explore a little bit more what was contained in there. But Siddur Rav Amram Gaon is at that time Spain was still writing all the channels. Everything was going to Bavel. Bavel was still going strong. Those were the Goinim. They were the the heads of world Jewry at the time, and so that's where, well, there's also Israel, but everyone was writing to Bavel, so you had the Jews of Spain writing there, and Avraham Cohen, as you said, wrote it a Seder, and that's important. Not a Siddur, was called a Seder, and as we'll see, that many Siddurim for many communities are actually called Machzer. A Machzer, today we think of Yom Rav, no, it's actually a Machzer for the whole year, it was called a Machzer. So you hear the old Machzer. Machzer Minik Bnei Roma is the Siddur of the Roman Rite, of the Italian Jews. It's not a Machzer for Yom Rav. Okay, so as you say, we started with Rav Amram, and you have many copyist errors. They say you'd have, this wasn't a time of the printing, before the printing press, and so afterwards Rav Sadia Gaon comes along, we have the Ashkenaz and many other Siddurim. But let's just a little bit more on Avraham Gaon before we move past him. What was contained in that Siddur? For those that, and you mentioned there's Mossad Cook, I think it's the Goldschmidt, I think, who did it, their edition. There was one volume, and then there's the massive, I don't even know if they're all available, the Eitzreinu / Machon Yerushalayim, massive multi-volume work at Avraham Gaon. But talk briefly about Siddur Avraham Gaon, and then we'll move past him.
Yes, I worked with 3 or 4 different texts of Rav Amram Gaon, including the Goldschmidt edition, including the Markitzi Nedamim edition, multiple different wonderful works that have been put out in the Seder Rav Amram Gaon. One of the more interesting things regarding the Seder Rav Amram Gaon, and if anybody would pick up a Seder Rav Amram Gaon today and you go to daven in your shul, you'd be lost. You're not going to be able to follow the Seder HaTfilah, whether it's Ashkenaz, Sfarad, or Nusach Edut Mizrach, using a Seder Rav Amram Gaon. Now, the reason for that is because it doesn't look anything like our Siddur today. Our Siddur today is much more developed and has much more rabbinic literature that was placed into the Siddur. Rav Amram Gaon was a very simple Siddur. It was a very basic Siddur. It goes from Shachris to Mincha to Mariv. It has Yomim Tovim. It has Shabbos. But it's not so simple. It's not so easy to follow. So certainly Rav Amram Gaon gave us a lot of material and gave the Jews of Spain and Barcelona significant amount of material in order to be able to daven. But it doesn't compare to the Siddur that we have today, and it continued to be developed, of course, post Rav Amram Gaon. The Rabbeinu Tamra actually writes in the Sefer HaYasher, fascinating, anybody who's not an expert in the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon has no right to make any changes in the Siddur at all. That means that Rabbeinu Tam gave enormous amount of credence and credit to the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. And the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, if you're familiar, is quoted regularly by the Tur. And all the codes very heavily rely on the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. So Rav Amram Gaon's Siddur became really the most classic and the most important, the most authentic Siddur because of his stature, because of who he was, and because of the time and the effort that he put into it. Now, that doesn't mean that the next Siddur, as you just pointed out, as of Rabbi Sadia Gaon, kept exactly in tow to the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. Now, if your listeners are familiar, Rabbi Sadia Gaon wasn't necessarily the same base medrash as many of the Gaonim, and he was very comfortable to disagree with the Gaonim. That's a show in of itself.
That was his uniqueness, right? He came from, just jump in, he came from Egypt. He was a total outsider. I always say it's like taking, I would think whatever analogy you want, it's taking a big yeshiva today and taking a complete outsider. It's not, he just was different. He came from a different country, didn't learn in their yeshiva, and they hired him as the Rosh Yeshiva.
Yeah, Reb Sadia, of course, was fascinating. Sefer Munas Videos, his philosophical work is extraordinarily important. But vis-a-vis the Siddur, just the study of the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon versus the Siddur of Sadia Gaon, which is about 100-year difference, Pachos Yosim, more or less, really will show enormous differences. Reb Sadia Gaon, by the way, the Siddur was not written in Lashon HaKodesh, it was written in Arabic, which also points to significant differences. The Siddur of Sadia Gaon has a different halachic approach than the Siddur and the Seder of Amram Gaon. So therefore, within the world of the Gaonim, when the world of the Gedolei Rishonim, the Gedolei Gaonim, the Siddur of Amram Gaon became this Siddur. And the fact that the Tur and other Gedolei Rishonim quoted regularly means that a lot of our tefillah today and a lot of the Siddur of the Rishonim, the Siddurim of the Rishonim, Siddurim of the Achronim, are leaning heavily on the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon.
Okay, we get Rav Sadia Gaon, we have the Rambam, we have the Rekeach, and the other Hasidei Ashkenaz. We're going to have the Mekubalim and Kabbalah's impact, especially the 16th and 17th centuries. And we're going to continue. So there's a lot there. I think we can just go on and on just about this, and we can never even get to the next part of the podcast. I think what's important here to discuss now is our current Siddur. Kind of fast forward, and you can discuss some of the, not nearly all of the Siddurim that you looked at and went through and that have researched and that impact us today, but some of what comes to today, again, picking just with broad strokes, Nus Ashkenaz, Sfard, and Edut Mizrach, what impacts our current Nusach, our current Tefillah, and of course, there are many variations between communities and Siddurim and Menhagim. We can't cover all of that here. Your book can't cover that. It's just way too broad, but just in brief, as much as possible. So what has, how we got to our Nuschas today and where those came from.
That's a big, big question, as you pointed out. But I would say maybe I'll share something a little bit personal, how I got into the Siddur, and maybe that would be helpful. The Siddur that's a very critical Siddur, I would say one of the most critical Siddurs, at least in my opinion, I think some would disagree, is a Siddur called the Otzar Tfilos. It's actually on the cover of the book. One of the pictures on the cover of the book is called, is the Siddur Otzar Tfilos. The Siddur Otzar Tfilos was printed in the year 1914. If I'm not mistaken, I think you did even a podcast or two with some of the new people who are putting out the Otzar Tfilos.
So I'll clarify just for a second. We'll get back. I said Tfilas as an aside. I did an episode of Rabbi Moshe Floor who did certain selections of it. He did certain parts, and he's still working on it, as far as I know. There's another new edition of Tfilas that came out. It's in the stores now, 2 big volumes. It's actually not the whole thing. I think he's still working on finishing certain parts of it, but those 2 volumes, it's the bulk of it. It's in the store. So you have that new edition, and then you have Rabbi Floor's new edition. But yes, talk about the Tfilas published originally in Vilna.
Yeah, the Otzar Tfilos is a very important sefer. Ad kedei kach that you see there are 2 individuals, 2 different institutions that are working on it today. It was printed in 1914, as you pointed out, in Vilna, and at least in the 20th century, the Siddur Otzar Tfilos is very critical, and it's actually the Siddur that sort of allowed my interest to percolate roughly a decade ago when I got a hold of it. I think it was the Siddur that sort of our parents' generation very much looked at, used, relied upon for being the text of the Siddur. It roughly encompasses 10 different commentaries. It wasn't one commentary. There are 10 plus commentaries. 2 of the most important authors that are used in the Siddur Otzar Tfilos is Reb Zundel of Bialystok, as well as Reb Shlomo Gordon. Reb Zundel of Bialystok was actually the author of the Eitz Yosef and the Anaf Yosef on the Agadata of the Ein Yaakov. And Reb Shlomo Gordon put out in the Otzar Tfilos Siddur the Tikkun Tefillah and the Iyun Tefillah. What found and caught my interest was really the Tikkun Tefillah. And what the Otzar Tfilos did is that he really, really carefully, methodically, academically goes and tries to discover who wrote each and every Tefillah. And that is where you see a lot of work and time and effort that is going into trying to get to the guts and the core of the author of the Siddur and the authors of multiple tefillos that were incorporated. Now, of course, he wasn't the first one to do that. A lot of the German Siddurim actually did that. And on the cover of the book, I have another picture of a different Siddur, which is one of those Siddurim, the Beis Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Emden Siddur, the Ruddelheim Siddur of Wolf Hendenheim, a very critical, very important Siddur, the Siddur of Odis Yisrael, Basel Ben Bear, also of German origin. These Siddurim were doing a lot of the same work that the Otzar Tfilos was doing, which was trying to really concretize and encapsulate generations and generations of Siddurim that were being written. So we need to appreciate that the development of the Siddur from Rav Amram Gaon and fast forwarding, roughly 1,500 years of the Siddur is that slowly there were a lot of things that were creeping into the Siddur. As you pointed out, we moved from Rav Amram Gaon in Spain and in Bavel and the Machzer Vitry, which in France, and the Hasidic Ashkenaz in Germany, and the Mekubalim in Tzfas and Eretz Yisrael. There's a lot happening and a lot developing. Every continent and every area of rabbinic expertise, from Medaktikim to Mekubalim to grammarians to people counting words like the Hasidic Ashkenaz, were bringing their area of scholarship to the Siddur. What the Iyun Tefillah, the Tikkun Tefillah, Rav Wolf Hendenheim did, Rabbi Shapsi Sofer did, of course, very, very important Siddur in 1617, was commissioned by the Vad Arba Artzos to write his Siddur, with the Haskamas of Gedolei Yisrael, arguably the most significant lineup of Haskamas ever in the history of any book ever written was the Siddur of Reb Shapsi Sofer. So there's an enormous amount going into the Siddur. So these Siddurim, let's call them post-1800s and the early 1900s, began to start to collect and to try to create the most authentic Siddur and the most correct Nusach and the Siddur of all Siddurim. So a lot of the work that I did in the making of the Siddur, and a lot of the work that many are trying to do in the Siddur, is to try to organize and to decompartmentalize and to try to get to the core of the Siddur and the development of the Siddur over, let's say, 1,000 years. I argue that the Siddur took, let's say, 1,000 years to be written, from 875 with the death of Reb Sadi Gaon until roughly 1875, which is the end, let's say, of the Gedolei HaChasidus and the beginning of Nusach Sfarad, which we're not going to have time to talk about probably today. I apologize to your Hasidic listeners. But for about 1,000 years, the Siddur was being created, was being written, was being worked through. And post 1875, 1900, 1915, etc., many Gedolei Yisrael and experts were trying to get and organize and put together the Siddur of all Siddurim to try to put all the puzzle pieces together. I hope that's a helpful answer in 3.5 minutes.
I hope so, exactly. This is something that you can't really do a regalachas, but we're trying to really compartmentalize it. But the thing is that a lot of those terms you mentioned are Ashkenaz or Yekish Siddurim, so they're not Sfard, so Nusach Sfard, or again, Eidut Mizrach, even though Eidut Mizrach is just one, there's different variations of Sfardi Nusach, as well as when you get to, we didn't even touch on, the Bnei Reima, the Italian Nusach that really predates Ashkenaz. You have their Nusach is still going. I have friends, and there's people that dive in that Nusach still, some that are diving that important Nusach, and you had there, so the Kem Chadavi Shuna was a commentary written on the Machzor Bnei Reima. You have Shadal's famous introduction to the Machzor. He really goes through a quite important intro where he discusses that Nusach. You have as I mentioned, Romanio Jews, the Jews from the Byzantine Jews, they had their own nusach similar to that one, and you had the Jews in the in Provence, South France, Carpentras, and that whole area. They had their own nusach. They had all different nuschas. That's without all the different variations and everything. Everyone davening differently. So the Siddur is moving, and we're trying to, as you said, say as much as possible. Just a word on Sfard though, and how it started. Well, Sfard in general, and then also starting with the Ari, and then the whole Kabbalah and everything. That whole nusach and the changes. Obviously, we're not going to spend a lot of time on all this. We're just the whole thing is generalized. All of this is general, but just a little bit there. I think we would be remiss if we skip that.
Yeah, no, you're 100%. Thank you, Nachi, for asking that question. I do want to point out that I think one of the most valuable parts of the book actually is that I create some level of clarity. And that is very important. And I hope readers are going to walk away, and I've, Baruch Hashem, heard already, people are walking away with more clarity and understanding about the development of the Siddur. That's really the goal. That's the mission of the book, that to allow Klal Yisrael to be able to appreciate, understand the most important book that they hold throughout their life and throughout the day. And that, I think, is one of the most valuable parts of the Siddur, that it shouldn't be a book that is, we get lost and we get confused and we just don't know anything about it. We don't want that to be. So I think there is a lot of value and clarity, Baruch Hashem, in that itself. But you're right. I think one of the most surprising things, especially for those who are not familiar with Kabbalah, say, I'm not going to learn Kabbalah, I never touched Kabbalah, I don't know what Kabbalah is, I can't even spell Kabbalah, is that your davening is very, very much influenced by the Chachamei HaMikubalim of Tzfas, of the 16th century, and the importance that the Arizal, the Talmido, Reb Chaim Vital primarily, but of course the Beis Medrash of Tzfas, what they put into the Siddur is really arguably one of the most significant additions to the Siddur, and that what we are davening today. We're in Elul, L'Davar Hashem Ori. I think we spoke about that before. Everybody likes to talk about L'Davar Hashem Ori, but I think the reason a lot of people like to talk about L'Davar Hashem Ori is because it became a tefillah that we just became so accustomed to, and it defines the month of Elul. But do you know where that comes from? Well, many people don't know where that comes from, and that's where we spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. But the Mechachmei HaMikubalim established an entire tefillah. It's called Kabbalah Shabbos. Now, I just want everybody to appreciate for a minute what that means. To add a word, a sentence, a passage into the Siddur, the scrutiny and the observation that's necessary to allow that to pass muster and to get into the Siddur is enormous. And that's a show in of itself what made it in, what didn't make it in. But the fact that an entire tefillah was added to the Siddur and was niskabel and Klal Yisrael, and that we're calling that Kabbalah Shabbos, that's a chiddush al gabe chiddush. Where do you go today in Klal Yisrael where Kabbalah Shabbos isn't being said? Now you'll find some yeshivas, some Beit Medrash, maybe where there's no Kabbalah Shabbos.
Yakis, maybe.
Maybe, but if Yankees love Kabbalah Shabbos too, let's be honest. Everybody enjoys Kabbalah Shabbos on some level, but the fact that this entire new tefillah is established, take Yom Kippur, tefillah's Yom Kippur Katan today, which has become very, very popular in many, many communities. It's an entire tefillah that's all coming from Moshe Kaverda, his brother-in-law, Shlomo Alkabetz. There's unbelievable amount that the Mekubalim put into tefillah. Now, my personal opinion is that the Mekubalim never intended for their tefillos to become sacrosanct and never intended for their tefillos to become official and to become part of quote-unquote the Siddur. But because of their gadlus and because Klal Yisrael accepted them and because people wanted to daven what they were davening, we became swept up. There's an unbelievable language of the Siddur Avodas Yisrael, which I pointed out moments ago as a Siddur that I looked to very much. He has a language by Kabbalah Shabbos. He writes, Pashta la'at b'chol ha'olam. That Kabbalah Shabbos slowly became accepted in the whole world. And that's a German Siddur. That's the Yakas you're talking about. That even though in the 1700s there was debate and discord whether or not Kabbalah Shabbos would become part of Tefillah in Germany, Ultimately, it did, and it was successfully incorporated. Even Avodas Yisrael, who is sort of the Makkabah Patish of the Siddur of the German community, includes Kabbalah Shabbos into his Seder Tefillah. So the additions of the Rizal Reb Chaim Vital, Ramesh Korver, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, the Sefer Charedim, the Seder Hayom, and all of the Gedolim Mekubalim, they have added an enormous amount into the Siddur Tefillah. Every morning, everybody comes to shul. Here's Birchas Shachar, and what do you say? Mizmor Shichron Nichas Abayis David. Why are you saying Mizmor Shichron Nichas Abayis David? You can't equate that to the Halalukas. You can't equate that to Taz Yashir. How did that get in? So many are familiar, and you should be familiar. The Vilna Gaon was very opposed to the recitation of Mizmor Shichron Nichas Abayis David. Where did that come from? Who snuck it in? And of course, we could talk about the Nusach HaGra. The Gra went back to Dina de Gemara. We have a chapter about that in the book. And the Gra was very adamant that any Siddur that had any additions that were not signed off on really by the Talmud and by Rabbi Lazar Kalir, any piyut that was not written by Rabbi Lazar Kalir, the Vilna Gaon said it has no place. It includes the Davar Shemori, it includes Mizmor Shichron Nichas Abayis David, it includes many piyutim. The Vilna Gaon had the shortest Seder HaTefillah. And the Tefillah of the Vilna Gaon is a Tefillah that many look toward. And then the Siddur Hagra, what we call today, is something that everybody's trying to figure out. There are probably 15 Siddur Hagra that have been printed over the last 2, 3, 4 decades. Everybody's always trying to figure out, what did the Gra want to daven? And the Gra, of course, was a Makubal too. And the Gra had a big Misar in Kabbalah, and wrote Sifrei Kabbalah that we look toward. So the Mikubalim, I think, is important for many to understand that they influenced our Siddur in a very, very significant way, in a very, very radical way, and a very, very important way. And people should appreciate and understand that whether you learn Kabbalah, you don't learn Kabbalah, the Siddur is influenced by the Mikubalim. And one of the places that happened, Nachi, is the Magen Avram. Avram Gambiner, one of the Gdolei Chachamim, Poskim, whose psak in Shulchan Aruch certainly is Niskabel and big chalakim of Klal Yisrael, the Magen quotes the Arizal, quotes the Shar Kavanos, quotes Reb Chaim Vital, quotes the Priyetz Chaim, quotes the Zohar regularly, hundreds of times throughout his commentary, and that really, to a certain extent, gave a big haskama to a lot of the tefillos that the Mekubalim added to the Siddur. So therefore, as we approach certainly the Yom Naraim and many of the tefillos of Elul and Tishrei, Hoshanas, and many of the tefillos, I would say, the Kabbalistic influence is enormous. And again, we touch on that quite a bit in the book as well.
Yeah, let alone L'Shaim Yichud. It is, exactly. So there's, very important to mention these influences and the changes. And you mentioned Nusach HaGra, which we didn't even mention, that you have a whole chapter on Nusach HaGra. And in the beginning of the book, you have a chapter going through each of these. Nusach Ashkenaz, Nusach Sfard, Nusach HaGra, going through all of them. And I just point out, because what jumped out to me, being someone that's a fan of Italian Jews, there's also the older Nusach Minagroimo, and again, mentioned all, but you can't get to all the Nuschais. But, there's just so many, again, it's such a broad book. But you did also mention something about Kabbalah Shabbos being added, other tefillas, that get added over the centuries. Brachmei, right? For those one, and then we have the Hiratzins. I think is that the Hiratzins by Rosh Chodesh Benching. That might be the latest edition, right? To davening.
That's arguably one of the most interesting things, in my opinion. I spend a lot of time with that in the book. But that's a great example, by the way. At Aruch HaShulchan rants and rails about the Hiratzin. I think his language is if it was up to me, I would cancel that Hiratzin. Now that Hiratzin was written by Rav. It's Gemara Maseches Brachos Daf Yud Zayin. But where did that get into the Siddur? If you'll allow me, Nachi, for a moment, and this is such an interesting... Go
ahead. Once I mentioned it, go ahead.
Okay, it's such an interesting area. And this, I think, is also one of the other areas that shocks many Jews. And that is, who had the authority to add any tefillah to the Siddur? And here's where we get to the famous publishers. And I know you love Italy, and we can talk about the famous Italian publishers who are non-Jews, who own the printing presses.
Stay tuned. I have a mini-series coming up shortly about print. We didn't really get into tefillah, but I have a whole baruch on this about Bamberg and all them, and then everyone's busy with Tfus Rishon and print. It's important, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Talk about it here. Go ahead.
Okay, so that's a very critical area. I mean, in the 1700s and 1800s, for example, two things that come to mind very briefly. There's a statement of the Shai Ephraim Zalman Mergolius, the Rav of Brod, and the Aruch HaShulchan, Michal Epstein, the Rav of Navardik. Both of them write very, very passionately and very, very adamantly that nobody has the right to add anything to the Siddur, to author a Siddur, to print a Siddur without rabbinic approbations and without rabbinic oversight. And both of them go to long extent to make that very clear, because they understood and they were watching what was happening over the last hundreds of years as the printing press began to develop and develop and develop, is that the printers had control of the books that were being written. And as such, they decided what could be added, what couldn't be added. I have two sections of the book where I call it the Curious Yehiratzon. And I think the Yehiratzon, that at least Nusach Ashkenaz, the Edut Mizrach, by the way, does not say that Yehiratzon, as well as the Yehiratzon that many will find in their Siddur after Shalom in Birchas Kohanim. Where did that Yehiratzon come from? Where did the Yehiratzon by Birchas HaChodesh come from? There's a very strong argument to make, and I discussed this quite a bit in the book, that it doesn't come from any rabbi particularly. It comes from the printers, and it comes probably from even a non-Jewish printer, and somehow it got snuck into the Siddur. If you ask most people, what's the most meaningful tefillah of the week, of the month, of the year? When do the women come to the shul? Birchas HaChodesh. And that Yehiratzon has the chazan, and he says it passionately with a lot of kavanah, and it's a beautiful, beautiful tefillah. But who said it belongs in the Siddur?
This also has to do with where certain tefillahs are. And we don't know if on the tangent, we're going to get back in a second, but like kind of Shabbat, where does that belong in the Siddur, right? Where does it, after Asher Yatzar? And this is, usually has a bracha to start. I mean, this is, the Rosh Hashanah says, that's how you should print the Siddur. Make sure you print them this way. And many Siddurim today still not done that way. And you're supposed to do it that way. Some have fixed it. But that's how the printer, whoever it was, made it famous, did it the wrong way. So then you have a Siddur done one way, because that's just what came to be. Sometimes is the case.
That's exactly right. So a lot of things crept into the Siddur, snuck into the Siddur. We didn't have the oversight, the wherewithal, the control of the presses the way that we do today. The Italian printers and the publishing houses had enormous power and control and money. And if you got to them, the work and the tefillah that interested you would make it in. Now, how do you deal with that? How do you address that? So the poskim like the Gedolei Yisrael dealt with that, as I just pointed out. The Aruch HaShulchan, Mishnah Berurah even talks about this, making sure that we're saying what should be said. From Rav Amram going to the Machzer Vitri, to the Seder HaRambam, and to the Chachmei Ashkenaz, and to the Mekubalim. There is a method to the madness, and there is organization, and there is clarity here. But because of the lack of uniformity and the lack of communication, of course, at the same time, this is before communicating was so easy, Siddurim, as you pointed out, one said it was being published in this community, one said it was being published in this community. So therefore, we had to start to organize things. But people should be familiar that, yes, a lot of the areas of the Siddur that it got in was because that. So much so, the Aruch HaShulchan is so bothered by that Yehiratzon. He said that Shalok Halacha, the Halacha and Shulchan Aruch, that you can't make a bakash on Shabbos. You can't make a bakash on Shabbos. So you can't make a request the same way on the Shemona Esrei is different on Shabbos and his Baruch Chol, because you can't just say V'lam Alshinim and you can't say T'kabel Shofar and Baruch Aleinu. So how can I make that Yehiratzon on Shabbos Mevarchim? That's all bakashos. So many Achronim try to be miyashev, try to reconcile how it could be that you say that. Aruch HaShulchan says, very nice, all the answers are wonderful and good, but at the end of the day, I can't support the recitation of such a Yehiratzon Shalok Halacha.
And I think the Yeratzin at the end of Birchas Ganav, I think the Gross says, I think to say Rebbeinu Shalom again, right? You don't know Yeratzin. Absolutely.
Mishnah Berurah, Chai Adam, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, all the Gedolei Achorim say that Yeratzin, we don't know, it's a podcast in itself, who authored that Yeratzin, where did it come from? You should know, as we pointed out earlier, that yes, it was Kabbalistic influence, of course, but at the same time, the poskim said, whoa, hold on. How'd that Yeratzin get in there? Slow down. And that's what a lot of the Siddurim from the mid-1800s until contemporary are trying to sort of piecemeal put together the Siddur that the Gedolei Yisrael could say is the Siddur that is accurate. Now, this happened already hundreds of years ago, as the, Vad Arbat, as I pointed out, commissioned Reb Shapsi Sofer to write the perfect Siddur, which was published in 1617. But of course, so much happened after 1617, Adayom Hazeh, 225.
And that you have the beautiful edition of Eitzreinu. I think it wasn't published in full till Eitzreinu published it, right? I don't know. But that was the
Reb Shapsi Sofer?
Yeah.
So the best edition today of the Shapsi Sofer is actually a 4-volume work that actually Ner Yisrael in Baltimore put out.
Yeah, through Eitzreinu. Yeah, correct.
That's correct. That's
that one. That's complete. That's
edition.
The whole of Shapsi Sofer.
They did a wonderful job.
So this all brings us to where there's so many different nuschos today, so many different things floating around. Family nusach and shul nusach. And you have a chapter on this also, and this is something that's very important. Many are thinking, well, okay, can I change my nusach? I want to now, listening to this, I did my own research, and I think that really should daven this nusach versus that nusach, or this siddur is corrupted. All these things there don't belong in here. I shouldn't say it. Whoever it is. And or something, that's the first part. And or it's when you go to shul, I daven Ashkenaz, and now I'm in a Sfarad shul. Or wherever you are, in a Sephardi shul, wherever you are. So these are various issues. Let's first start with someone interested in changing the nusach. And this place can both ways. You want to go from Ashkenaz to Sfarad, Sfarad to Ashkenaz. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so this gets into both of my books, the making of a minhag and the making of the siddur. You know, this became a very prominent question in the 1500s and the 1600s when Jewish communities became dispersed and ultimately became a melting pot. So therefore, once community, Salonika is a great example of such a community, which was one of the first communities of Ashkenaz and Sfard were sort of coming together and joining, and there were Ashkenaz shul and a Sfard shul within minutes of each other. And that caused the question that Gedolei Yisrael and the Poskim and the Tshuva Sfarim start to discuss is, you know, let's have in a different shul, or you intermarry, Sfardim and Ashkenazim. How do you handle that? And that question continued to become stronger and stronger, of course, post-Holocaust, when communities like the Hungarian community and the German community, and the Polish community and the Lithuanian community, and Eastern Germany and Western, and so many different communities became a melting pot in this country, in the United States of America, and Eretz Yisrael, of course, after the Second World War. So that question became very pronounced. And therefore, Moshe Feinstein, Lamashal, and Igros Moshe has multiple tens of tshuvas regarding this. Some of them are very well-known tshuvas. He has a tshuva that Rosh Hashiva in Eretz Yisrael sent him regarding whether or not a bacher who was a Davin Nusach Sfard, grew up Nusach Sfard, now came to yeshiva, where that's Ashkenaz yeshiva, could he stop davening Nusach Sfard and instead begin to daven Nusach Ashkenaz, like his yeshiva, not like his parents? A very, very important tshuva of Moshe Feinstein. And these types of tshuvas are the questions that many are asking today. And today with the influx of Balei Tshuva, for example, and Gerim, you know, what do they daven? And then the influence of many people learning in Eretz Yisrael and the Nusach HaGra and coming back to America. The most important thing that I think is critical to mention is that the minhag hamishpacha is very, very important. Your family minhag is significant, is very significant. Now, I'm going to be very vulnerable here, and I'm going to admit that I actually changed my nusach. My father davens nusach Sfard. I daven nusach Ashkenaz. So how do you explain that? Now, I have Ramosha to lean on, of course, Ramosha's famous tshuva. Ramosha says that, yes, absolutely, nusach Ashkenaz is the nusach of all nuschos. And those who are of Ashkenazic descent are very happy, proud of that tshuva. Those on Nusach Sfard are very disappointed in that tshuva because Moshe really believes that Nusach Ashkenaz is the ultimate Nusach. The reason that I changed is because I really never started Nusach Sfard. From get-go, I went to Ashkenaz yeshivas, and as a result, I was trained in Ashkenaz. Even though my father wanted me to continue Nusach Sfard, it wasn't so practical. So I think that has a lot to do with it today, is that background of family coupled with educational institution, yeshiva that you learn in, often could conflict. But today what's really happened contemporarily is it jives much more. That we become a very homogeneous community, and every house and shul and yeshiva is almost identical. But I think at the turn of the century, certainly after the Second World War, when Jews were coming to Ellis Island, this was a big mess. And what used to have called the Hungarian Shtibel and the Polish Shtibel and the Yakas each had their own Beis HaKnesses. But what happened is we became a melting pot society, vis-a-vis the Siddur, vis-a-vis the Beis HaKnesses, vis-a-vis Halach and Minhag, and therefore people became swept up in the shul that they became part of. But I think it's very critical that everybody continues to daven the Nusach HaTfilah of their family. And I will point out that one of the most important Marmakomas in the Sugya is one that the Arizal and the Ruchaim Vital quotes from his Rabbi, that there are Yud Beis Sha'arim. There are 12 gates to get your tefillah to heaven, and each shar has the same derech, the same pipeline to get to Shemaim, and each and every single shar is critical. Now, this statement of the Arizal and Chaim Vital became really the point of contention between Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfard, because this became what allowed Nusach Sfard to start its Nusach, because they say, well, we have a Shar Yud Gimel, we have another Shar, and we could start our own Nusach. And that became what the Hasidic masters, based upon the Baal Shem Tov from the Arizal, started what's called Nusach Sfard. But everybody should be familiar, comfortable with their Nusach, daven their Nusach. I'm certainly not a proponent of changing Nuschos just because one strikes you. If there are tefillos that interest you in a different Nusach, open up that siddur and learn them, study them, find time to daven them, but certainly not to be very flippant and change a Nusach. There's no halachic right to do that. You can't just daven one day Sfard, one day Ashkenaz, and what to do if you go to a different shul. Like I said, that's a chapter in the book, and hopefully people have their poskim and bottom to discuss that with.
Okay, So now that we're over 40 minutes into the episode, there's a number of different ways we can take this episode, and we had these conversations back and forth for a few weeks trying to figure out what do we do with this episode, right? Is it one episode? Is it multiple episodes? Is it a mini-series? Because the book, not only this, there's a chapter in the book on the sanctity and halachos of the Siddur. So there we can talk about the whole thing, right? It's holding a Siddur while davening, moving during Shemoneh Esrei to retrieve a Siddur, making changes in the Siddur, using a Siddur with pictures, using a Siddur printed on Shabbos, using a Siddur. There's all sorts of other halachas. These are just aside fascinating halachas to discuss. Okay, there's that. Then you go through each tefillah individually, the tefillahs that form the Siddur. Adon Olam, Yigdal, Berchas HaShachar, Psukkah de Zimra, Shemash, Shemoneh Esrei, Tachnun, the conclusion of tefillah, Kaddish. Then there's the tefillahs of Shabbos, Kabbalah Shabbos, Berchas HaChodesh, tefillahs of Yom Tov, Berchas Kahanim, Anim Smiris, and then there are various appendices that you include according to the Psak of Moshe and other things. So the book, it just, even though it's not a massive book, you tried not, it's over a little over 300 pages. You tried to make this doable and readable for those. I'm sure you have much more to add from your own research. So there's a couple of different things. Obviously, we still could come back. We could still revisit and break down each one of those chapters and do a mini-series. If anybody wants to sponsor such a thing, please email me. If there's an interest in that, let us know. But for this, we decided, okay, that's not gonna make sense in one episode. And this is being released Yom Noraim. I think we should focus on some of the tefillahs of the Yom Noraim. We're coming up to Rosh Hashanah, Aseres Mei Tshuva, Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot. There's now so much tefillah and so many different tefillahs that we're going to be doing. I think it's important to discuss that, and that's something that's always fascinating for people. As I said at the beginning, tefillah is always interesting. I always get great feedback when I do an episode on tefillah, but especially now, this is the time of year everyone's thinking about davening, already saying slichas. It's like, what's going on? We're saying all these interesting different tefillahs. I think we should turn to some of the tefillahs of Yom Noraim. I think last year when we did our Tishrei-themed episode on Minhagim, we discussed LeDavid, but there are various other ones. I'll let you pick it up where you want to discuss which ones. Let's discuss some of them and their origins and where they come from and who says them. Let's discuss some of those tefillahs of the month of Tishrei.
Sure. So I think we were talking about Kabbalah, and I think that interests a lot of people. Let's talk about Mimamakim. Shir Mas Mimamakim is fascinating. Perikuf Lamed, to a certain extent, is very defining of Chodesh Tishrei. It's the tefillah that the Chazan really gets worked up for, and the tzibur is very heightened. It's Pashtus. It began with the Bishal Salant. If you want to know my opinion, where Mimamakim and Esa'en, Kuflam and Kuf Chafal come from, it's probably what we would call minig yeshivas, which is another minig we'd even touch or talk about from the Alta Slobodka. Maybe somebody wants to sponsor that one, Nachi. But certainly, Mimamakim is very, very interesting. So let's explain why it's interesting. Now, when is Tefillah of Shir Mas Mimamakim said during the Aseres Mei Tshuva? Between Yishtabach and the bracha of Yotzei Or. Now, the Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Nun Daled that you can't be mafsik between the recitation of Yishtabach and Yotzei Or. So what happened? Ad Kedei Kach, that the Gemara Masechah Sotah says that anybody who speaks in between Yishtabach and Yotzei Or, if you're going to war Pashas Kiseitze and you're a sinner, you got to go home. What is an example of a sinner? Somebody who speaks between Yishtabach and Yotzei Or. So now all of a sudden, we added Mimamakim. Why? How? Is that the appropriate place? So interestingly enough, the Magen Avraham, who I mentioned moments ago, is really one of the great supporters of the editions of the Mekubalim, says in Siman Nun Daled regarding the recitation of Shir Malos during the Aseres Mei Tshuva in between Yishtabach and Yotzei Or, Tzarech Iyun Minolan. I don't know where this comes from. I don't know why it's being said. It's beferish against the Shulchan Aruch. It's a Gemara Mufreshes. It's codified by the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, the Tur, the Beis Yosef. You can't be mafsik. So Minolan, where did it come from? Now, it is interesting to point out that although the Magen Avraham was a strong supporter of Kabbalah, here specifically, he takes an oppositional approach to this edition, which certainly dates back to the Arizal, and the question becomes, why and how is it possible to say it? So the sefer called the Likutei Marich, which is a very valuable sefer of Hungarian authorship, Rabbi Chaim Friedman, and he does a lot of work on tefillah. And he says the following line, and this also begins to help people in your audience, I hope, appreciate the Siddur. He says that Tzarech Iyun of the Magen Avram doesn't trump the Vadai of the Arizal. You hear that? The Tzarech Iyun of the Magen Avram doesn't trump the Vadai of the Arizal. Meaning, the Arizal said that you need to say Perek Kuf Lamed during the Aseres Mei Tshuva because it has a lot of significance and value and import and impact. So just because the Magen Avraham says, I don't get it, I don't know why, and I don't understand why it's not considered to be a hefsek, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be recited. So therefore, that creates sort of the dichotomy in different Kehilos and Klal Yisrael. For example, the Mishnah Berurah codifies to a certain extent the psak of the Magen Avram. So those who are very much leaning on the psak of the Mishnah Berurah, many Ashkenazi yeshivas and many Ashkenazi Batei Medrash and shuls and the like, won't say mimamakim in between Yishtabach and Yotzeor because the Magen Avram and the Mishnah Berurah leave it b'tzarachin. On the other hand, because the Likutei Marich and those who are influenced by Kabbalah, Chasidim and the like, they're going to say Shir Malos because of the Arizal. So it's a very wonderful example of where you begin to see splintering and distinctions between Siddur l'Siddur, between Beis HaKnesses, between Beis HaKnesses, is Shir Malos Mimakem. So on the one hand, it's a very valuable, it's a very important tefillah, and we should say it with Kavanah, but a person should also know that there is disagreement regarding that tefillah. There are many places actually that say Shir Malos Mimamakim after Shmoneh Esrei. During the Asaras Mei Tshuva, we want to say Mimamakim, but we don't want to say it there. So therefore, that's a nice example of where you begin to see the metamorphosis and the origin and the development of a particular tefillah and how it began to split. Another example maybe we could give is Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu is such a powerful, important tefillah defining of the Yom Noraim, defining Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Asaras Mei Tshuva. Where's Avinu Malkeinu come from? So Avinu Malkeinu comes from a Gemara, actually. It's a Gemara Maseches Tainis, Daf Chaf Hey Mebez, if I'm not mistaken. There the Gemara recounts a story. There was a tremendous famine. There was a drought, actually. And the Belazar went up to the Amud of the Beis HaKnesses and began to daven and daven and daven. The heavens didn't open up and it didn't rain. Rabbi Kiva mounted the Amud and he said, Avinu Malkeinu lo melech alata. Avinu Malkeinu l'manach Elokeinu. And Rabbi Kiva recited two Avinu Malkeinus. That's all he recited. So that's the source of Avinu Malkeinu. But where do we get from two Avinu Malkeinus that were successfully turned into rain pour and showering to our Avinu Malkeinus today? So there's a sefer called the Kolbo, and the title of it actually certainly tells us what it's about. It's a Kolbo. It's everything. It's halacha, it's agada, it's musar, it's psak. The Kolbo says that what happened is actually that because Rabbi Akiva's tefillah was answered, the Rishonim said that let's add more Avinu Malkeinus, because Avinu Malkeinu is such a powerful tefillah, and slowly but surely, from the Zman of the Rishonim, Avinu Malkeinu began to become part and parcel of tefillah's Yom Noraim, that's what the Kolbo writes, and then became part of the tefillah of a tainis because of the tainis itself that took place anytime there's a drought. If you look in the Sfarim of the Rishonim, you'll see certain Sidurim of the Rishonim included Avinu Malkeinu, certain didn't. If you look in the Seder example of the Rambam, you're not going to find Avinu Malkeinu. It doesn't exist. It's not there. However, for example, in other Siddur, the Machzor Vitri, the Seder of Amram Gon does have Avinu Malkeinu. So therefore, you get to see another two different lines that existed. There's those who supported the recitation of the lengthier Avinu Malkeinus based upon the Kolbo and the Seder Tefillah of the Rambam. There were those who didn't because the Siddur of Rambam going to the Machzor Vitri. Ultimately, today, the Avinu Malkeinu has become accepted for hundreds and hundreds of years. But again, Avinu Malkeinu's development and its source allows a person, I think, to daven a little bit better. If you understand that it had the impact to allow rain to come from heaven and to change the situation in the drought, and as a result, the Chachamim and the Rishonim said, let's add Avinu Malkeinu because it's so impactful. Hopefully a person will begin to appreciate that Avinu Malkeinu is such a critical tefillah, let's say with Kavanah. And the same thing is true of the Shir Malos Mimamakim. You know, if the Arizal was willing to overlook what seems to be a halacha mufareshes that you can't speak between the recitation of Yishtabach to Yotze Or, there must be significance to that tefillah. And everybody has to know and understand that the tefillah that they're saying has import, has power, has impact, and it needs to be appreciated and understood. We can go on and on, Nach. You tell me when to stop. If the other tefillahs you want to talk about.
Keep going. No, more tefillahs. Keep going.
More tefillahs. Okay. Another thing that I find interesting, actually, is, throughout the year, there's certain tefillahs that we trample on. Take, for example, Adon Elam, Yigdal, Anim Zmiros, and Aleinu. If you would take a vote amongst your listeners, how many people are saying Adon Elam, Yigdal, Anim Zmiros, and Aleinu regularly? You're in a rush, you run out of Aleinu. Anim Zmiros, some places, some shuls say Shabbos, some Yom Tov, some only Yom Kippur. Like, why and how did these particular four tefillos become so prominent, Dafka and the Yom Noraim, when B'chol and when the entire year they're not really recited? So let's start with Aleinu. Aleinu has significant prominence in Rosh Hashanah. In the beginning of Malchias, the Aron Kodesh is open, then you recite Aleinu. On Yom Kippur, we only say Aleinu, you don't say Al Kenekava. Who authored Aleinu? Where did it come from? And why is it in Malchias section of Rosh Hashanah? And why is it the last tefillah that we say Kimat when walking out of shul? So the truth is, if you look in the Siddur Ish Yisrael, which is not a Siddur that we spoke about enough on the show, but that's Talmidei Hagra, basically, the Siddur Ish Yisrael, as do many Rishonim, quote a tshuva of Rav Haigon. Going back to the Gonim, Rav Haigon suggests that Aleinu was actually authored by none other than Yoshua ben Nun, the outstanding disciple of Moshe Rabbeinu. From there, Rav Haigon said, even though Klal Yisrael was exiled to Bavel, Rabbi Yochanan Zakeh made a takana. Rabbi Yochanan Zakeh from the Talmidim of Hillel Zaken established many takanos to allow Klal Yisrael to succeed in diaspora. And Rabbi Yochanan Zakeh said, even though Klal Yisrael were abolished and sent into exile, even though Yoshua ben Nun established Aleinu to be recited when you go into Eretz Yisrael, we need to keep on saying Aleinu in the Galus and in Bavel. And then what happened? It became part of the Seder of Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, not the Seder HaTfilah of the Chol. And if you take a look at the Seder HaTfilah, which I just pointed out to you, he writes, and it certainly seems to be correct, that really Aleinu was transfixed and transposed from the Machzer to the Siddur. That's what happened. It was part of the Machzer, was not always found in the Siddur. And if you take a look in some of the earliest Siddurim, you will actually find that Aleinu is in the Machzer of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim and is not in the Siddur HaTfilah. Because of that very reason, that really it's meant for Tfilas Musaf. The Siddur Otzot Tfilas has a fascinating suggestion, very original, creative suggestion. I actually thinks and suggests that it really wasn't authored by Yoshua, but it's actually authored by none other than Rav, the colleague of Shmuel. And the reason he suggested it because Rav established much of the Seder HaTfilah of the Yom Noraim, Malchios, Zechronos, and Shofros, and therefore likely he was the one who actually authored Aleinu itself. So Aleinu really was a very, very critical tefillah of the Yom Noraim and the Yom Noraim only, and then it was transposed to the tefillah of Chol. The Ramah paskins that Aleinu should be recited. The Tur brings Aleinu. So Aleinu became part and parcel. So the poskim made and brought Aleinu into the Siddur tefillah of Chol. But on Rosh Hashanah, it becomes such an important and critical tefillah. Anam Zmiros is similar in that respect. Anam Zmiros is an unbelievably fascinating topic. It's a whole chapter of the book. It could be a whole podcast, and I'm not doing justice to it, unfortunately. But Anam Zmiros is a major machlokes in the book, Bach and the Levush. The Bach takes a position, and he says he has Kisvei Yad and a Masorah that Anam Zmiros should be recited every day. The Levush, who is a contemporary, says absolutely not. Chalil v'chas, it's too important of a tefillah, it's too holy of a tefillah, too sacred of a tefillah. People don't take it seriously. It should not be recited every day. So this is a wonderful example. You have a machlokas, the Bach and the Levush, whether or not Anam Zmir should or should not be recited every single day. So what do you do? So you know what happened? What happened is there was a contemporary of theirs, and his name was Reb Shapsi Sofer. And Reb Shapsi Sofer, in his Siddur, has to opine on this. And certainly everybody looked at Reb Shapsi Sofer, and whatever Reb Shapsi Sofer is going to say is going to carry significant weight. And what's more complicated and complex about this, actually, is that Reb Shapsi Sofer himself had a haskama from the Bach, but he was a Talmud of the Levush. Talk about a conflict of interest. What do you do there? You're a Talmud of the Levush. The Levush says not to say Anam Zmiris daily, but you have haskama from the Bach. What's he going to do? So he follows his Rebbe, and he does not add Anam Zmiris to daily tefillah. He only puts in a tefillah of Shabbos, like his Rebbe, the Levush, and therefore a significant number of shuls recite Anam Zmiris not during the day and not during the week, but only on Shabbos. You'll ask me, many shuls don't recite on Shabbos, they only recite on Yom Tov. That's because the Gra and the Aruch HaShulchan say you can't even say it on Shabbos because it's such a holy tefillah, therefore you should only recite it on Yom Tov. And what do? We do what the Maharil says. Most, I shouldn't say most, but many shuls will recite Anam Zmiros either Leil Yom Kippur or the morning of Rosh Hashanah and the morning of Yom Kippur. That's the Gra and Maiserav, Talmidei Hagra, from Mishkolov, says that it should be recited Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur morning. The Maharil says only by night. So what you find here is something very interesting. Adon Olam, Yigdal, Anam Zmiros, Aleinu. Tfilos that are sometimes said during the week, sometimes said on Shabbos, sometimes said on Yom Tov, really had their origination in Tfilos of the Yom Noraim. So much so that Adon Olam, which I think most don't say, some will say it sometimes at the end of the davening, it's published at the beginning of the Siddur. Again, a whole chapter on Adon Olam, one of the most interesting chapters in the book. But the Mata Moshe, Rav Moshe Met, has a very important comment in his Sefer, he's a Talmud of the Maharshal. Anybody who says Adon Olam, your listeners should hear this, anybody who says Adon Olam with Kavana on the Yom Noraim, he is Eidus and he's a guarantor from Rav Haigon, from the Gdolei HaGaonim, that your tefillah will be accepted. And therefore in shuls Kimat, on every continent, Adon Olam is a very significant tefillah, in many, many shuls, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur morning, because of this statement of Moshe Met. So just appreciate that again. People should understand, Adon Olam all of a sudden takes extraordinary prominence in Tfilas Yom Kippur. When? Why? Where? It seems to me that's because of this comment of the Mata Moshe. Right? So if not so long ago we're talking about, 1700s, that all of a sudden Adon Olam takes prominence there. Now, Adon Olam, who was the author of Adon Olam? Subject to great controversy. Look in Rabbi Yaakov Emden's Siddur, and you look in the Yitzhak Tfilos, much debate about who actually authored Adon Olam. But nonetheless, Adon Olam's recitation during the week, or on Shabbos, or on Yontif, or on Yom Kippur, all stems from hundreds of years of debate and rigor and controversy. Yigdal, there's not enough time to talk about Yigdal. Yigdal was an unbelievable machlokes. We talked about Kabbalah. The Arizal was a strong opponent of Yigdal. Yigdal shouldn't be recited. He even writes and specifies explicitly that Yigdal shouldn't be recited. Why? Very unclear. Chaim Vital didn't exactly tell us. We have speculation as to why Yigdal was one of the tefillos that the Arizal specified should not be recited. Certainly its authorship was questioned. We don't know. Maybe it was written by Rabbi Shlomo Gabriel. Maybe it was written by the Onim. It's questionable. It's so much so some even suggest, Rabbi Yaakov Emden suggests it's actually written by the Rambam, which is highly unlikely, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself suggests that. But nonetheless, Yigdal is important, and there are shuls that do say Yigdal. Some say it Shabbos evening, some only say it on Yom Tif. So there's so much. I hope I'm not confusing people, Nachi, more than I'm creating clarity, but I'm certain that what the book does do is will allow people to have a clear understanding, appreciation of the development, the Seder, the history, and the origins of Tefillah in order to daven better. That's my goal, and I hope we're able to get there and to do that.
Absolutely. Hopefully this is interesting, enlightening, and the book has more. What about the additions in Shemana Esrei that we're going to start saying Rosh Hashanah and go straight through to last Yom Kippur?
Yeah, sure. So, we talked about Rav Sadia being radical and being different. Rav Sadia actually held that you shouldn't say those additions at all. They don't belong there. Who has the right, even the Gaonim, who has the right to add Zachrenu L'chaim, Melech Havitzchaim? Who has the right to add Uksov L'chaim Tovim? How can you say Michamoch Avrachmin? We're talking about Avos Gvuros and Kedushas Hashem, the most significant, parts of Tefillah. So Reb Sadia Gaon said, no, those can't be added. And this is a great example of a point of contention between Reb Sadia and his colleagues that, of course, was not accepted and didn't even find a place at all in Halacha. What did find a place in Halacha is a very significant machlokas rishonim, the Beis Medrash of the Balei Tosos, the Rach and the Ri. It's actually the second to last Tosos in the first parak of Maseches Brachos. Is let's say somebody fails or forgets to say those additions in Shemona Esrei during Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Says, do you go back or do you not go back? So actually, this machlokas, which in Tosfos is not exactly clear what the nekudas machlokas, or the point of contention is there. If you take a look at the Bach and Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Rosh Hashanah and Tav Kuf Pei Gimel, he points out that actually what they're debating is how much authenticity does an addition of a gon have to Shemona Esrei. That the opinion of the Rishonim that you have to actually go back if you forget those additions in Shemona Esrei means that they are considered to be kilu, they were nisakin by Anshe Knesset Agdola. That's the language of the Bach. That's what the Bach explains the opinion does it. That addition in Shemona Esrei, the fact that the Regonim Rishon said that you have to go back and repeat the entire Shemona Esrei, the reason for that is because it takes on the status of a tefillah Anshe Knesset Agdola. The other position, of course, is what do you have to go back for? The Anshe Knesset Agdola didn't sign off on that. There's no stamp of approval of Evezer HaSofra and Zachrenu L'chaim Uksov L'chaim Michamocha. So therefore, if you forget it and you miss it, you don't go back, as opposed to HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat, which you do have to go back for. So that's a fascinatingly important machlokes, but certainly it should speak to the value and the significance of those additions that we're saying, Shemona Esrei, that there's a sheet in Rishonim and Gonim that if you don't recite them, you have to go back. Now we pass in Shulchan Aruch, it's an uncontested, both by the Mechaber and the Armansim Tav Kuf Pei Beis, that if a person forgets those additions, you don't have to go back, which speaks to the fact that they're not considered to be as significant as the change of Hakel HaKadosh to HaMelech HaKadosh, or HaMelech HaEtztak Mishpat to HaMelech HaMishpat. But those additions create significance that if you look at many of the Sifrei Halach, I think the Mishnah Berurah makes this point as well, that when it comes to the tefillos of the Aser Simei Tshuva, the Yom Noraim, a person should daven so carefully, cautiously, meticulously, because of the value of those additions. You don't want to miss those additions. They're talking about Chaim Tovim, very significant things. So you don't want to lose out on those recitations. So say them carefully, say them with kavana. And what's really beautiful today, of course, is many of our contemporary Siddur, and when I say contemporary, I'm not even referring to the 1900s, I'm referring to the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, is that people need to appreciate what's gone into the Siddur that you use today is diametrically opposed to the Siddur that existed 100 years ago. You'd have to flip and you'd have to look. You'd have to be a Talmud Chacham to know how to daven. You know what? If you forget HaMelech HaKadosh Melech HaMishpat, so today you look in your Siddur and it tells you exactly what to do in English, Hebrew, Spanish, or French, or Japanese. Nobody knew how to do that in Radin in 1930. That was an impossibility. And you had to ask the Rav. Maybe you had to get to the shelf and look in the safe. You had to walk to the Rav's Shender and to ask him. Today you have your Machzer and you have your Siddur, which are so beautiful, so organized, so crisp, and so clear, giving us the directions that we need, what to do, when to do, how to do it, and how to make those changes. And we should all really appreciate the scholarship and the efforts that gone into many publishers in our generation to create a Siddur over the last 50, 60 years. Many of our listeners, the Birnbaum Siddur. Who remembers the Birnbaum Siddur? You can't even find it in a shul today if you tried. The Solar Pool Siddur, those are Siddurim that we don't see anymore, but they tried. And this is really in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, to try to begin to develop a Siddur and to create and to fashion a Siddur for Achenu B'nai Yisrael to be able to daven properly with kavana, with proper intent and proper intention, to be able to approach our Creator.
One more thing about Yom Rayim is the tunes, not changing tunes or changing tunes. I think this may be in your other book, The Making of a Minhag.
I do talk about The Making of a Minhag, but I talk about it here too. Yeah, tunes.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, tunes are amazing. Tunes are fascinating. It actually dates back to a scary story. It's found in the Maril. It's paskin actually by the Ramah, Simitaf Reishut Tes, and Hilchos Yom Kippurim, that a shul, a city, a town can never change its tune. Can't change your tune. Why? Why not? What's the big deal? How many shuls are familiar with an Asana Tokev? That tune is an ancient tune. Some even suggest, actually, and there's good sources for this, talk about this in the book also, that probably goes back to the Moranos. Actually, that tune, that's when they showed up to daven. It's the only time they could daven, and that haunting tune, which we're preparing for in the weeks ahead of Kol Nidre, that gets us very excited. You can't change that. You want a chazan, you can't. Well, why can't you change it? So the story goes like this. It's found in Mariel, Hilchos Leil Yom Kippurim. It's sourced by the Ramah, the Beis Yosef, the Torah. They all bring this story. The Mariel actually was visiting a town called Regensburg. And Regensburg, he writes, was where Rabbeinu Ephraim was buried. And he took the Amud, the Mariel took the Amud, he wanted to daven for the Amud, and he wanted to include a piyut and a tune of Rabbeinu Ephraim l'chvodo. He's buried there. And the Gabayim and the Rashi Hakol said, you can't do that. That's not the piyut that we say here. This is, part of what we're talking about, the making the Siddur. You can't say that. And some sort of disagreement, occurred between the Mariel and the Gabayim. And the Mariel got up and he added the piyut of Rabbeinu Ephraim in Regensburg to the dismay of the Gabayim and the Rashi Hakol. Mariel writes, shortly later, his daughter died on Yom Kippur. And he writes that was as a result of what he did. As a result of him changing the nusach and adding that piyut, his daughter died. Now, that's a frightening comment to make, but the Mariel himself says the Mariel is from Gedolei Rishonim, is all Ashkenaz leans on for Psak Halach. The Ramah looks to the Mariel regularly. So that psak of the Mariel and that statement of the Mariel, which was codified by the Ramah, ultimately became a very critical source that you can't just tinker with a nigun. Now, when I say you can't just tinker with a nigun, we're referring to the classical nigunim that go back hundreds, years, and centuries. Today, it's very common, for every new tune, a new singer that comes out with a new song. So, the chazan already picks up for V'chol Maminim. We're not talking about that. They added piyutim, which we don't have time to talk about now. That I believe and I think and I posit and I think Klal Yisrael has shown that those are additions and tunes and songs that could be added. But when it comes to the classical nigunim, take Nesana Tokev is a good example. Borchu, you want to tell me that you can't change it? I'm not gonna, I don't know. I'm not prepared to go on air and to say that that's a tune that should be tinkered with. The Mariel is telling us something. The Ramah is telling us something. Al Yeshana Adam me nigune v'minigun ha'ir. That's something significant. Something has value to it. A song is powerful. A song creates understanding. The Maggid Avraham, actually, his taich and his explanation as to why you can't do that is actually because people get confused. people are familiar with the tune. I know the shul's tune. I know the city's tune. You start singing another tune, people will get lost. At Teres Zakein, Pri Megadim, others say the reason you can't change it is because Al Pi Sod, Al Pi Kabbalah, you can't change it. Sefer Hasidim says you can't change tunes because it's Al Tasig Vul Rishonim. We don't like creating new inventions and making changes that existed for hundreds and thousands of years. So that really speaks in general to the Siddur and, and Minhagim in general and what we talked about before, changing the schos. We don't like, traditionally to make significant changes at all. It's not something that we do unless there's rabbinic support, unless there's reason to do as such. So therefore, songs, tunes, nusach, piyut, we didn't talk about piyutim at all. Which piyutim are in on Yom Kippur and which piyutim are not. And when we stopped saying piyutim, how could we stop saying piyutim? Piyutim were written by, Gedolei Rishonim and Gaonim, Reb Shlomo ben Gamliel, Reb Lazar Kalir and others. There's a lot in the Siddur, and I hope the takeaway, I don't know if this is my goodbye or not, but I hope the takeaway is that the Siddur is so rich, it's so valuable, it's so full of meaning, it's so full of history, it's so full of halacha, of minhag, of Kabbalah, of psak, of piyut, of midaktikim. There's so much there that a person can gain from. There's so much to learn about the Jewish people. There's so much to learn about Gedolei Yisrael. There's so much to learn about who we are, what we do, when we do, why we do. There's so much to learn about machlokes, what's in, what's out. The Siddur is really a treasure trove of the grandeur of who we are as Klal Yisrael. And I hope people will be able to appreciate that from the short time that we have to speak together. Obviously, I'm always happy to come back and talk to you more, Nachi. But Be'ezus Hashem, I hope people will be able to use the book in a way that would allow their tefillos to become more meaningful, more understandable, and understand the background like we spoke about at the beginning. Anything that's important, we want to get to the core, get to the guts, get to the root of the issue. We have to be knowledgeable Jews. We need to be people who are thinking Jews. We need to be people who are understanding. We can't just go through life really just, what we call davening it up, like they used to say, in the old country. Let's, and I'm not even talking about beer tefillah. I'm talking about just understanding the book that you are holding in your hand. Let's do it.
And I want to end with one last question: is who is this book meant for?
Oh, thank you for asking that. I actually just got an email from our publisher from Feldheim. Somebody's looking to buying the book and asked that very question. I should probably read you my answer because it was a very well written answer. I'm gonna have to.
You can read it.
I'm gonna have to find an email. I don't want to take too much of your time, but it's for everybody. That's the answer, and that's really the success of the book. And I hope many of my books that I intend that the most simple Jew and the greatest scholar can gain from it. It's meant for men, it's meant for women, it's meant for educated youngsters who are interested in understanding. The footnotes are certainly, in and of themselves, can lead to enormous amount of research and information. Reading the text of the book itself, I believe anybody and everybody that's interested in the Siddur, from the biggest Rosh Hashiva to the the most elementary level Jew, a Baal Tshuva will read this book and will be able to learn a lot about what we do, from Adon Olam, Tanim Zmiros, to Birchas HaShachar. I mean, who knows about Shema? We haven't talked about Shema and Shemon Esrei. The most basic. Kiva said he waited his whole life to die. Al Kiddush Hashem to say Shema. You have to say Hashem Chalom Chalom. What do people know about Shema? Why Shema? Hayam Shemo Avayomer. Who knows that? So the book is intended to allow people to be able to really, really use it according to your level of interest and your level of knowledge. Everybody will absolutely gain something from the book. I am able to say that with confidence.
Okay, and as you said there's many things that we didn't get to. So as I said earlier, I'll reiterate, if anybody, please, email me, WhatsApp me, message me if you're interested in more of this, and so sort of mini-series perhaps. If anyone's interested in sponsoring, reach out to me, let me know, and potentially we definitely could do more. I also do want to give a shout out here at the end to Zevi Kaufman, who wrote me a copy of this book, hot off the press, in the summer, so I could read it right away. He handed me, it came from Eretz Yisrael, and kept following up. Let's go, when are we going to get the podcast on? And Baruch Hashem, we got it done here, and hopefully everyone finds this podcast episode meaningful and enlightening, as well as checking out the book. It's the perfect thing for Rosh Hashanah time and for this time of year to read, whether you're reading it during davening or you're reading it throughout the Yom Tif season here. So I'll link in the show notes that anyone interested can purchase it. It's on your website, it's on Amazon, it's on Feldheim, it's in all those farm stores. Anyone interested can purchase it. And want to wish everybody a ksiva chesima toiva and a good kaben shtiar.
Thank you. You too, Nachi, and Brach Vatzlach, continue all the great work you're doing.
Oh, man, thank you for joining me once again.
Pleasure. Thank you.